Hello, and welcome to the first Q&A of the Home Mastering Masterclass. Thanks for joining us. We've got a few people here on the call with me live, and we'll crack straight on with the questions. I think what I might do to start with is see whether I have any questions from people who are here. Well, it's not a question as such, but Bob had a query that I've answered by email, but I think it's something that a few people might have, so I'll answer it here as well. And then if anybody wants to follow up on any of the details, we can. Bob was saying he wanted to check his understanding that if he's choosing to master at -14 LUFS integrated, similar to the K14 system, if anybody uses the Bobcat's method of judging loudness, and used my recommendation of limiting to -1 dB FS or true peak level, would the PLR be 13? And the answer is absolutely yes, because you've got -1 subtracting -14 gives you a difference of 13 dBs peak to loudness ratio. So yes, Bob, you've understood that completely. And he says the reason I ask, and this is what I was going to follow up on slightly, is that YouTube is where a lot of his music is going to be is destined for. And it seems to him that it makes sense to optimize his music for YouTube in that case, which is absolutely correct. What I would say is that because YouTube doesn't use LUFS, as far as we know, you're not guaranteed of a predictable result. You're pretty much guaranteed it won't play any louder than -13 LUFS, apart from the cases where their algorithm basically seems to miss a few examples. Pretty much everything that is any louder will get turned down. Quieter stuff is not turned up. So let's say they were using something that was based more on RMS to judge loudness, and this kind of feeds into a question I'm going to cover in a little while. RMS is much more sensitive to bass than an LUFS reading. So if your track had quite a bit of bass in it, and therefore the RMS reading for it would be higher than the LUFS reading, YouTube might decide it's louder than you think it is and to turn it down slightly. So that's an example of where you might have an unpredictable result. Or conversely, if you've got less bass, I guess you could have a situation where you think it's louder than YouTube does. Less bass kind of doesn't make sense. Let's say you had more upper mid-range, perhaps. Then the LUFS reading might come out higher than the equivalent RMS reading. And in that case, YouTube might not turn it up as much as you might expect. So, you know, it's your mileage may vary. What I would say is that I found it's pretty reliable. Basically, you can. I've mastered a lot of stuff recently, and you know, a PLR of 12 is quite typical for a reasonably varied album. That means the levels are well. It probably means the overall levels are hovering around -14, and then it's pushing up to -12 sometimes. Well, I'm getting confused now with my -1 peak, but if the PLR is between 14 and 12, you'll get an integrated reading that is somewhere around those levels, and the loudness will sound as you expect on YouTube, which, you know, is the kind of the ideal goal. And in fact, I don't know whether any of you saw today, I've just started a new thing today, posting 2-minute mastering tips on Facebook. And today I suggested that people use a fixed monitoring level, as I teach at the beginning of the course. Whereas tomorrow I'm going to be suggesting to them that they actually choose their monitoring level by listening to stuff on YouTube, because I think that's a good pragmatic solution these days. It's where a huge number of people find their music. It's a bit on the loud side, you know. If everybody used -16, which is the AES recommendation and which is what Apple Soundcheck uses, I think that would be better. That would give us more flexibility. Tidal uses -14, so it's got an extra dB of space. But I think YouTube is a pretty good compromise. And for most pop and rock music, you're going to have plenty of space to get a great sound with 12 dB PLR. So yeah, I think, you know, playing some stuff off of YouTube, set the monitoring gain, and that becomes your mastering level. That's a pretty sensible way to proceed. Of course, if anybody wants to do slightly differently because they want more dynamic results or less dynamic results, then that's, you know, that's your decision. But I think that's quite a good starting point. So does anybody on the call kind of have any follow-up questions to that? Bob, did you have anything? I apologize if you didn't want your question aired. I didn't actually ask your permission for that, but hopefully you don't mind.
Actually,
no, I'm not hearing anything, so I'm going to proceed with some of the other questions. So we have one here from Miko. He says, I've always stacked all my plugins on the master output channel when mastering in Logic. In the week 1 video of Obvious, and actually in all of the other videos, pretty much, you put all the processing plugins on the channel and use only the metering plugins on the master output. What's the difference? The main difference is you'll see when we come to the final video in the course, Miko, that the way that I like to work when I'm mastering is not actually with just a single track at a time. I like to lay out all the tracks in an album or a group of tracks in the DAW at the same time, so that I can flick between them and compare, so that I can balance them against each other and tweak the settings. So you will see, well, you'll already have seen me doing a bit of that in the first 3 videos as I kind of bring songs from earlier weeks in, but in that case, I'm bringing the rendered files in. That's not typical either. That's just for convenience, because I'm using different DAWs so that you know, the sessions aren't compatible. In the real world, I would do the whole thing in one DAW, say Logic or Pro Tools or Wavelab or whatever. I would have all the songs up and have individual settings for each song. So in that case, I can't put all my processing on the master output bus unless I was somehow going to recall different settings for each song as it played or something, which I think that, I mean, that's possible, and that's the way that some people used to do it back in the day, but it's pretty clunky and it's not needed these days. So yeah, individual processing with the possible exception of the limiter on every song, and then just metering. I put perception on the master output of Wavelab, maybe a global EQ, perhaps, if, you know, if I mastered the whole album and then decided that overall it was a little bit bass light or top heavy or whatever. But typically there's no processing in the master section. So yeah, that's the reason behind it. Hopefully that makes sense to everybody. Feel free to jump in if you have any queries, but if not, I will move on to the next one. And of course, if any of these questions, hopefully I'll answer them usefully. If not, by all means, come back and ask me for a follow-up. So a few questions here from Clement, who, first question, how do you work on songs that you don't really like, for whatever reason that may be? Which is a good question. Oddly enough, I would say it's actually harder to work on stuff that you do like, because there's a risk that you become too respectful, almost. You know, mastering is this funny thing, is this kind of balance of being humble and arrogant. You know, I mean, you're being arrogant because if you're working on somebody else's stuff, if you're working as a mastering engineer for a client, they bring you this stuff. They've worked on it for weeks, months, maybe years. And in the space of 4 to 6 hours, you say, well, no, that should be like this and that should be like that. And there you go. You know, actually it's a dialogue and it's a conversation, but you know, that's a kind of slightly strange position to be in. And I'm lucky that most people agree with my opinions. On the other hand, for me, you have to go into that process having kind of understood the intention of the artist, the original mixer, and kind of, you know, understand intuitively where they are trying to go with the music and take it further in that direction, and not try and turn it into something else. You know, it's not I don't see it in my place to impose my vision on what the artist has done. It's a collaboration. It's an interpretation of what they're where they're trying to go, and sometimes they're almost there, and sometimes they're actually a way off, and so it's a balancing act. And going back to your question, Clement, I think the risk is that if you have kind of too much respect for the original material, you might not go as far as could be needed, in term or as far as it would be ideal to go. I don't have that much of a problem with that. A typical process for me would be master the first song, think, yeah, this is great, put in perception so that I can level match it, and then think, oh, actually, hang on, I've moved a bit too far away from the way that it was originally, and I kind of toned down some of the changes that I've made. If it's stuff that I don't like, it becomes, I think there are very few things that I really don't like. I think something that in terms of whatever I'm working on, I try and find something that I like about every project. Even if it's just the sound of one instrument or a particular aspect of the performance or something creative they've done with the mix or the arrangement, or something that's quirky or amusing, or I enjoy the music even if I hate the sound of it. Or I think there's almost always, I had a pretty tough time. I mastered a 10 CD box set of Birdsong once. And I did okay on the first couple of discs, and by disc 10, that was getting a bit wearing. I'm not very fond of steel bands. Well, actually, that's not true. I'm not fond of recordings of steel bands. Now, that's an interesting point. I'm just going off on a tangent with myself. Maybe I should try and get some high-res recordings of steel bands, because maybe that would be the missing ingredient that would make me kind of get or enjoy the recording of that particular instrument. Anyway, but with the exception of that, I mean, there's some bad country music is something that good country music is fantastic. Bad anything is tough. And the really tough clients are when you have, yes, steel drums, Sigurdur. You put me off now. Oh, the really bad thing is when you have something that is bad and the client knows that it's bad. You might think it's worse when the client doesn't know that it's bad, but it's actually worse when the client knows that it's bad and expects you to do something about it. Like the vocalist is out of tune or whatever. And that might sound silly, but it's happened several times in my career. So, yeah, I see working on stuff that I don't really like as an enjoyable challenge, Clement. Maybe that's just, I very much choose to see the pot as half full whenever I possibly can. So yeah, it can be tough. I mean, I refused to work on an album of stuff that I'm pretty sure was Nazi propaganda a long time ago. It was, kind of, I guess, neo-Nazis, some kind of thrashy, punky band, whatever. And I couldn't really tell what they were singing, but I was pretty sure it was offensive. It's pretty rare that I just genuinely won't work on anything. But yeah, I think the key is to try and find something that you like about everything. And I think it's very rare that, I'm just kind of, I guess there was I've done a lot of compilation albums of covers of recent chart hits. That kind of stuff is fairly grinding work because it's not been done with any passion or any, it's a completely cookie cutter process at every stage prior to the mastering and basically the mastering stage as well. So that's but I read magazines when that happens. There's always a positive to everything. Okay. Are the decisions for more bass and or more highs always a question of taste, or are there songs that you always use to judge and compare how much is enough? Well, this is an interesting thing. I was saying this in another conversation somewhere. I'm constantly recommending to people that they use reference tracks. I actually don't use reference tracks very much myself at all. That probably sounds like a double standard, but actually it's more the case that I've just kind of internalized that stuff over the years. And I know the monitoring that I'm using so well that I'm not saying I never use them. I do kind of recalibrate sometimes. But I tend not to use reference tracks. So I guess in that case, the overall level of bass and treble becomes a matter of taste. I mean, I always like to say, let me get the window so I can see what I'm doing, so I can see what. So if this is the complete recorded spectrum of sound, I would say what actually ends up making it onto CD typically is more like this. You know, there are things over here. I mean, I guess there are CDs of white noise and complete silence out there. But, you know, most music kind of falls into this kind of range here. And most listeners will find that completely acceptable in terms of, let's say, something really toppy over here and something really bassy over here, or something really quiet over here, or dynamic and something really loud over here. When I master things, I'm kind of doing stuff in this range here, which is the range of my taste. But even within that, there's some room for subjective movement. So this bit, I don't feel is opinion. That's just, I guess it is my opinion, because some people would do this, some people would do this, and I'm choosing to do that. So it's my opinion, but I wouldn't feel comfortable mastering stuff outside that range. Mastering for me has always been a bit like an itch. You know, I just sit listening to something for long enough and it feels wrong, and I want to get there and fix it and make it sound the way that I want it to sound. But then where it falls exactly within that little range, then I think, yeah, it becomes a matter of taste, you know, and that's the kind of conversation that I have with clients on the session. They usually agree with moving it to that fairly narrow range. And then it's, well, okay, so exactly how loud do we go with this? Maybe this song should be a little darker or a little brighter. And, you know, at that point, I think it is more or less an aesthetic judgment, you know, a judgment call based. And if somebody's given you a reference track and they said, that's what I want, then you would always use that as a benchmark. But I think I answered your question, Clement. That was from his first email where he said, that's it for now. I hope there's a bad mix in there somewhere. I just want to reassure you guys that, well, I wouldn't say there's necessarily a bad mix, but there's certainly a challenging mix coming up later in the course. I think I said somewhere in the course notes that one of the early comments from people was that most of the mixes that were coming were of pretty high standard, which is not always what we have to work with. So yeah, there's some more interesting cases coming up a bit later in the course. And then from the second email, Clement asked, basically said he wasn't quite clear what the signal routing was with the parallel compression example in the week 3 video. Because he doesn't use logic. He's saying, I guess it was routed to 2 destinations at the same time, with one of them being untouched by the compressor. Is that right? And yes, that is right. He says in Studio One, you can't bus channels to multiple destinations, but you can do it by using sends and auxes, which would achieve the same result. And that's absolutely correct. You need to be careful with older versions of Pro Tools. I believe there are some distinctions between how buses and auxes work, but I'm not a Pro Tools ninja at all, so don't take my word for that. But I think in any modern release of a DAW, if you route it to some kind of stereo channel, it should be bit for bit identical with the original. And yes, so the basic idea is just they call it multing sometimes, where you basically take what was one stereo signal and turn it into 2 stereo signals, and then you can process one of those hard and the other one differently or not at all, and blend the 2 to taste. So that was the concept behind that. And that was actually Clement's final question. So those are all the questions that I have found that came into me, excuse me, via email. If I've missed anybody's question, please let me know and I will include it in the next one. I discussed Bob's conversation about PLR and optimizing things for YouTube. There was a discussion. Okay, Matt, I think this was a discussion that you brought up on Facebook in the Facebook group, which I just thought was interesting and kind of worth a bit more discussion here, which is I've touched on already in my answer to Bob about the different degrees of bass, which is the challenges of using a VU meter. Because a VU meter, even more than an RMS meter, is much more sensitive to bass than a digital meter, and especially than an LUFS meter, which is designed to prioritize the area of our frequency range where our hearing is most sensitive. The the interesting thing, so a classic example of a challenge with a VU meter would be, say, something dancey with a big pounding kick drum in it, because the kick is high up in the mix. It contains a lot of bass energy. When I look back at some of my masters and look at them on a VU meter, quite often the needles will be pushing right up into the red on every kick drum beat, so kind of up to the +2, maybe even +3 on a VU meter. So that kind of might seem to contradict the guidelines, the general guidelines I'm giving you for the course. Again, I mean, maybe this is just me being half glass half full. I actually see the sensitivity of a VU meter as a positive, because you can actually infer information about the balance of the mix based on what the VU meter is doing. So if the VU meter, if the mix sounds loud to you, but the VU meter is reading low, there's a good chance it's got lots of upper mid energy, which our ears are very sensitive to, that makes it sound loud to us, but don't necessarily cause the VU meter to give you a high reading. Whereas if the VU meter is pegging or looking very high and it doesn't sound that loud to you, that's probably a clue that there's a lot of bass energy in the signal. So that can actually, you can almost get more information than the meter is really telling you from learning to read it in that way, which is something that I like. I mean, the other thing that I like about VUs is the fact they're so sensitive in the middle of the range. So it's much easier to tell when you've deviated from what you're aiming for, which is your kind of calibrated 0 level. What I would say though is, I think if you have, at the point where the needle actually pegs, hits the top, you stop getting information at that point. It's like when the audio clips. You don't know whether the audio clipped by a dB or 4 dBs or 6 dBs. And the same with a VU meter, if it hits the stops. So in my experience, if the loudness sounds right to you, and when the bass isn't pounding away, the level looks about right on the VU meter, but the needles are still pushing too high, that's probably an idea that you either need to tweak the EQ of the bass or possibly apply some more dynamic control to the bass. I like, even with something that is kind of dance music and, 4 to the floor kind of stuff, I don't like to see that needle hitting right up to +3. I guess you could even recalibrate, if you feel like it needs to be louder, maybe that's a case for then recalibrating the VUs for that song or for that album, just so that you have the information so you can see exactly how high it's going. Because in my experience, if something is balanced in terms of the EQ, the VU meter should be at least under control. There are exceptions, there are some kind of huge bass drone or whatever where you get very high readings. With all of these things, we're ultimately using our ears, not our eyes. But so yeah, to summarize that, there is an art and a skill to reading a VU meter. I think it's one that's worth pursuing, even if you don't immediately find it intuitive. And you can take the readings with a pinch of salt to some extent, but at the end of the day, I still feel that a balanced mix at the right level is not going to make the meter go wild. It could go very low sometimes, and I'm quite comfortable with that, providing it sounds right. When you think of it as, so if it's a quiet introduction, or if it's a quiet passage, or if it's something a bit more, it's kind of spacious and ambient in the middle of a piece, or if it's classical where you've got low level sections, then I think it's absolutely fine for the VU meter level to drop right down, because the bottom of the scale is only 20 dBs below the 0 position, which is not that much. On the other hand, if the chorus looks right, but the verse is way down, unless the verse is maybe, acoustic guitar and voice, and the chorus is full tilt band, that might be a sign that actually there's too big a difference between those, and that you might want to do something to address that. I won't go into too much more detail in that, because there's actually an example along those lines coming later in the course. So yeah, hopefully, well, Matt, you said that's good information to know. Oh, okay. What kind of processing would you reach for at this point? Sorry, at which point? go ahead. Let me turn my hands up. Yeah, go ahead.
When you said when the bass was getting too loud, but it would need some kind of treatment at some point, what kind of would you be reaching for?
Probably a multi-band compressor.
Right, okay.
I mean, first thing would be the EQ. Would be just listen to it and listen for maybe there's a resonant frequency. You know, maybe there's one note that's booming out. If you're, you know, kind of, I mean, one thing you can do temporarily is just filter out all the high frequency, so that you only have, say, up to 160 or 200 hertz, because that will stop you from being distracted by everything else that's in the mix. And then you're just going to listen to it and listen for things that are singing out. Also, listen for a correlation between if you hear a boomy note, but you don't see it on the VU meter, or if you see something on the VU meter and you don't hear it, that could be a clue that there's actually something going on with the room, and it might be time to reach for the headphones and double check. But if you get to a point where you're confident that what you're seeing and hearing genuinely reflects something in the music, then, so just as an example, my mate Nick Watson mastered the last Seal album, produced by Trevor Horn. Bit of a dream job for him. He's a huge Trevor Horn fan. He did a fantastic job on it. Sounds amazing. I noticed when I was listening to it that the first song on the album has a note in the bass line that really sings out. It kind of works musically, but I was listening to it here in my little room at home, and I kind of thought, well, is that something genuine that I'm hearing? Or is that, you know, a property of my monitoring situation? Is that actually the room or the speakers singing out in a way that's not accurate? So I looked at it on an analyzer, and I thought I could see a bit of a lump at the right point. In the end, I got Sigurdor, who's an old graduate of this course, and often helps me out, to take a listen. You know, I'm sure you guys have met him in the Facebook group, on his system. And I had to kind of prompt him a few times, I think, because, like I say, it works musically. So I'm not like saying there's anything wrong with it. But at some point, he kind of said, yeah, there's a note there that kind of rings out more than the others, which was kind of useful for me at that point, because I was, you know, I'm still kind of always testing this room to make sure to kind of find the limits of what I can hear in here. So it was reassuring for me to find out that it was accurate enough in here that was a reliable feedback. And it's also an example of something musical. I don't know whether Nick had that conversation with Trevor when they were mastering it, and that was a decision, or whether it just didn't bother either of them. Maybe it's slightly more noticeable in here than it was in their room. You don't know. If it had been me, I would at least have suggested a little bit of a notch EQ just around that frequency range to solve it. And in that case, it would probably have worked. There are other times where the bass is just kind of wild. It's just kind of uncontrolled. It's an interesting challenge. I'm working on a product called Home Mastering Compression. And one of the interesting things about doing these products is trying to figure out what it is you do when you're working and convey that to other people. So you get this kind of instinct of when things are not controlled enough dynamically, but it's pretty hard. I don't think I at this point can give you a cast iron formula for that. I think one example might be that if you try the EQ and it doesn't work, you know, well, okay, so one really obvious example is if you try the EQ and it works for the thing you're trying to address, but something else goes wrong. Yeah. So let's say you've got a mix where there's a booming bass note, but there's also a lot of low end energy in the guitars or the synth drones or something. So when you reduce that frequency with the EQ, it works for the bass, but everything else in the mix starts to sound thin and hard. Mm-hmm. That's a case where compression is going to work better, because the compression will only happen when that particular frequency sings out, and the rest of the time it will move through. You might also consider a dynamic EQ, which is kind of a similar idea, but a bit more targeted on a particular frequency range. So yeah, the tools would be EQ or compression of some kind, but exactly what you would use and how depends on the context. Does that help?
No, brilliant. Yeah, absolutely. I use FabFilter Pro Q2, which is just a brilliant EQ, and well, anything else I can get my hands on really. But yeah, that's I don't use multi-band compressors as much though, so it's not something I'm so familiar with. But I do understand how they work, so it's more a case of
John Tidy from reaperblog.net, my co-host on the mastering show, made a meme for me. I still can't remember who it is. There's an old guy. He looks a bit like a country and western singer, grey beard. He's kind of leaning forward with a glass of Jack Daniels or some kind of whiskey kind of drink. Well, that reminds me, where's my whiskey? Huh. I left it out in the other room. I need to go and get it. And so the caption on this, the meme is, well, John's version of it was, I don't always use multiband compression, but I do use it a lot. And I think the original is, I don't always use blur, but when I do, or I don't always do this, but when I do, I use whatever it is. So yeah, I tend to use it a lot, but I use it in a way that is as much like single band compression as I can get away with. It's not like 6 bands all wildly doing stuff. So I would like to think that I don't overuse it by any means. Quick recommendation. I don't know whether some of you already seen this, but there is a great EQ plugin called the Nova EQ TDM Tokyo Dawn Mastering, which is has dynamic EQ capabilities that I really like it as an EQ anyway. It has an interesting different sound to something like the Pro Q. But the dynamic capabilities of that are also quite helpful, especially doing the other thing, which is bringing something up. I've been talking about kind of wanting to hold back things that are singing out, but sometimes there are holes in the frequency spectrum that you want to fill out. One way to do that is to boost with an EQ and then compress it to get it back under control. But the other way to do it is to effectively use a dynamic EQ as an expander to fill those holes. So when the signal is quiet, it actually lifts that frequency range above where it was originally and then brings it back in the louder sections. So the advantage being you don't get as much, well, I don't know. I need to really get my head around this. Every time I start thinking about dynamic EQ, I end up thinking it's actually the same as multiband compression. It's just kind of coming at it from a different angle. So I can't get my head around that right this instant. So but it's another interesting tool.
Yeah, got you. Brilliant. Thanks very much. Yeah, brilliant.
No, pleasure. Cool. Okay, well, I've come to the end of the questions that I had prepared. So now it's just a question of whether anybody else. Oh, let's go over and look at the YouTube window and see. Cams, do you have a question?
Yes.
Go ahead.
I'm mixing and mastering my own material, and I've just finished going through some of Joe Gilder's mixing stuff and some of Graham Cochrane's, and I'm wondering where I should be putting the levels on the mix bus before I take it into mastering, and should I be having compression or anything like that on the mix bus before going into the mastering stage? What would you recommend on that?
It depends.
Okay.
As always. I mean, if you've been mixing into compression on the mix bus, then I would keep it because it's part of the sound of your mix. And if you're happy with it, then you wouldn't, the risk is that you turn it off and the mix falls to pieces. If you haven't already used any, I don't really think slapping it on at the end is going to be beneficial, because you are probably going to do something similar at the mastering stage. I mean, to some degree, what we're doing at mastering is like doing bus compression after the fact. Mm-hmm. So if you have something that's been heavily compressed on the mix bus, you probably don't need to. You probably would use limiting only in the mastering, for example. Or if you have something that's very lightly compressed in the mix, you might use a lot of what is effectively bus compression. So, and neither one is right or wrong. There are people out there like Graham is very much in favor of top down, what he calls top down mixing, where you put compression stuff on the master bus. That's not how I mix. I'm not saying it's wrong. It's just I prefer not to rely on that compressor at that point. I think Joe is also going in that direction. So It might be time for me to have an argument with them online about it. The definitely no limiting. In terms of the overall level of the mix, it's kind of irrelevant because you're going to change it at mastering anyway. You know, I mean, you don't want it to be clipping, and there's no point in having more than 3 or 6 dBs of headroom. There's probably no harm either if you're saving it out as 24-bit, particularly if you use dither. But I think aiming for sort of 3 to 6 dBs headroom is quite sensible. The other thing is it kind of automatically builds in reasonable gain structure prior to that. I just in the last few days saw it was somebody. Oh, maybe it's Stephen Slate. Yeah, that's right. There was a CLA, a Chris Lord Algae video that people had seen where he had all the channel faders clipping in the DAW, and people going, doesn't he understand gain structure? And Stephen made the point by posting another video that that's absolutely fine. In a modern DAW, you've got 32-bit floating point processing. It doesn't matter if you clip the channel faders, providing the level gets pulled back at some later stage in the chain. Whereas back in the day, that was definitely not the case. However, Stephen also mentioned that if you have analog emulating processes in there, like say an SSL channel strip or a UAD emulation of a Fairchild or a 1176 or whatever, those kind of plug-in emulations, or if you're using real external analog gear, those processes will saturate in a way that's intended to be like real gear. And if you run the channels very hot, you may be doing much more of that than would be than let's say an engineer back in the day actually doing that stuff for real would have done. And therefore I think that it could be one of the most common things I see these days is just mixes that are already pushed way too hard when they get to the mastering stage. And I think possibly one root cause of that is just people using these analog emulating plugins and unknowingly pushing them much hotter than is good for them. So whereas if your master fader is at 0 and your peaks are kind of leaving 3 to 6 dBs headroom, it's unlikely that anything prior to that is maxed out, simply because you would then have to be pulling the levels back everywhere, and the mix would look weird. So the other way to look at that is to put either a VU meter or an LUFS meter and just judge it by loudness. And again, this depends on the mix, but I think as a rule of thumb, if the VOMT comes out calibrated at -18 out in the box, I think that's a good place to be for mixing. That corresponds to the old guidelines for 0 VU in terms of dBU, in terms of voltages and all the rest of it for analog processing. And if the loudness levels are hovering around there, it's very unlikely you will clip the signal on the output or anywhere else. And it's also very likely that you will have decent gain structure going into it. And you'll probably find when you do that, you have roughly 3 dBs of peak headroom, unless you're squashing stuff really hard somewhere else in the mix. So that's not a bad, but I mean, you could go lower. You could go with, I've seen people recommend the -23 LUFS numbers, the recommendations for broadcast, for mixing. And I think in 24-bit situation, any of that kind of stuff is fine. It's a really common question. I'm seeing it more and more, people wanting to know how loud should I mix. And I know that if I put up a blog post making these recommendations, before long people will come back and say, what's he talking about? There are no rules for mixing. It's a creative process. You can do whatever you want. Just like when I put one up about peak headroom and said, yeah, I think 3 to 6 dBs is sensible. People kind of go back, no, unless if it doesn't clip, it doesn't matter. I mean, the blog post says, it gives 3 answers. In fact, I think I linked to it later in the course if I haven't already. Basically, if it doesn't clip in terms of peak level prior to mastering, that's good. And you don't really otherwise need to worry about it. But that doesn't mean that it's not a good idea to keep an eye on the peaks and keep them under control for all those other reasons. None of them are essential. I guess it's a bit like, what is it like? There's probably a driving analogy, where it's a good idea to check your rear view mirror every half a minute or so. You know, if you're on an open, empty road, it's completely pointless, but that doesn't mean it stops being a good idea. I don't know whether that's a good analogy or not, but yeah. Does that help?
Yeah, very good. I know Graham talks about some of the emulation plugins that he uses having a sweet spot where they work at their optimum level, and if you go beyond that, it'll change how it sounds.
I think that's absolutely true. You know, back in the day with analog gear, if the level was too low, you weren't using the full signal to noise ratio of the gear effectively. And when you later boosted it up, the hiss would come up with it and it would end up being noisier. On the other hand, if you went too hot, it would start to distort. So the sweet spot was somewhere in between those, where you balance, you know, a little bit of that analog saturation, say tape saturation, or clipping the mix bus in the analog console might sound nice. People might like that. So a classic example that always pops into my head when I'm talking about this kind of thing. One of the first two albums I ever bought for CD. I'm going to show my age and my embarrassing musical heritage here. Well, no, first one was Rachmaninoff's Second Piano Concerto, which is not embarrassing at all. But the other album that I bought was Days of Midnight by Magnum, which is English hair metal of the 80s par excellence.
I remember them. I never bought it.
No, I don't blame you. I still have a soft spot for them. But the funny thing is, I remember reading about them talking about mixing it at the time, and they said, yeah, so we recorded the drums to digital for the clarity and everything else to analog for the warmth or something. And I'm sure they had good reason to do that, although it's not the best sounding album in the world. But that's actually backwards to the way most people do it. A classic thing to do is to record drums to analog tape, because you get a certain amount of built-in soft clipping of all of those spiky transients on the drums just by the process, even if you record fairly conservative levels. So you can end up, that's one way to get kind of quite nice, big, full, warm drum sounds. And then you might want the clarity and the space and the detail of digital for other things in the mix, perhaps. So yeah, it always makes me smile because they kind of did it the opposite way around than most people would recommend you do it. So yeah, I think the sweet spot, you know, there are various sweet spots. There's the sweet spot in terms of distortion versus signal to noise, and then there's the sweet spot of sounding good. Quite a lot of analog gear sounds good if you push it quite hard, and quite a lot of it sounds quite horrible if you push it too far. So I think, you know, the sweet spot is finding that zone there. But personally, I would err on the side of caution. I mean, I saw a post on Reddit recently where it was talking about loudness, and there was a reply, and somebody said, if you Google enough on the topic of loudness, sooner or later you'll come across a very severe middle-aged gentleman who talks about this, that, and the other. And I was like, hang on. I mean, okay, yes, I am middle-aged, but severe? I don't think of myself as severe. Since then, it's occurred to me that they might have been talking about bobcats. So I'm less concerned about that. But what was the point of that anecdote? Oh, I've completely lost my thread now. What was I talking about just before that? We're talking about levels, sweet spots.
Drums and digital
drums,
clipping.
transients, digital processing. I've remembered. Even if they were talking about bobcats, I think, you know, I'm 46 now, just recently. So I'm going to have to accept that I am basically middle-aged, and therefore my musical tastes, I think, might be a bit out of date, because basically I really intensely dislike a lot of the sound of some of the current stuff that's out there in the charts. But I genuinely believe at the moment there is just much too much saturation going on, over process, you know, transient designers and tape emulations and all the rest of it. You know, there's all this stuff that sounded great back in the day, that all those classic albums were made of. Then everybody went digital and it all got thrown out because the tools didn't exist, you know, and suddenly compressors and EQs were just things that you plugged numbers into. And obviously people missed that, especially the engineers who were used to all of that old classic stuff. Now you've got all of these much more sophisticated emulations coming out, and we can get much closer to the original sounds that were in those things. But I think people have done the classic thing of assuming that the reason those old records sound amazing is because of the gear rather than because of the skill that went into producing them. You know, a huge amount of what goes into all of those classic 70s and 60s, 70s, 80s albums was to do with the rooms they were recorded in and the mics that were chosen and the arrangement choices and the players and all the rest of it. Some of it is to do with the gear. But I think the temptation now is that people coming into this afresh are like, oh, well, the secret of that is to push this processor really hard. And you just have, you know, everybody's got their foot to the floor with all of this stuff. And I just think everything would sound a lot better if you just rein it in and get much more subtle with all this stuff. And sometimes you do, you want to push, you know, distort the hell out of something, or, you know, overdrive, whatever it might be. Excuse me. But yeah, I just think in general there's too much. That's a very long-winded way of saying I think there's too much of this kind of stuff. So I think if in doubt, err on the side of caution would be my recommendation. There you go, rant over. Steve says not to mention auto-tune. Hell, let's not. We don't need another rant this evening. I won't get started on auto-tune tonight. Okay, well, good. Any other questions before we round this up? Any follow-ups on anything? I always think it's a good sign when I don't get too many questions, because it means that everything that's needed is in the course, which is the ideal situation. But nope, good. I'm not seeing any hands up. I'm not seeing. Oh, let's double check the YouTube comments. I need a link which I can get from here. Copy, paste. I'm currently demonstrating a crucial skill, which I'm sure you all know already, but that is the ability to talk about what you're doing at the same time as you do it, so that the client doesn't just kind of sit there while you fiddle and they feel like they're part of the process. So I'm now reading my YouTube comments. Okay, not much going on here. Carl says, interested to ask what the red book standard is. Okay. Also, could I ask you, is it best to keep levels below minus 18 dB during mixing for extra headroom during the mastering stage? Okay, I think we just covered that one, Carl. Peak levels, no need to go that low. I mean, some people recommend it. I think some people recommend keeping peak levels below minus 10. People whose opinion I respect have said that a lot of analog gear, and particularly a lot of prosumer modern digital gear like converters and stuff, actually operate best if you don't push them too hard. I've also seen people completely refute that. I don't have any personal experience myself, but you know, I think 3 to 6 dBs peak headroom is a sensible way to go. In terms of the loudness, so RMS or LUFS, then yes, I think minus 18 is a great place to be. The Red Book standard. Red Book standard was the specification for CD. It includes all kinds of things that are not really relevant these days. For example, there's lots of things that I still do. So one example would be the countdowns on CDs. This is something I cover towards the end of the course, but I can just kind of briefly go over it. For every track on a CD, you have a start flag and you have an end flag. You don't have to have an end flag. If you don't have an end flag, then you have what's called a segue PQ point. They're called PQ codes because they're carried on the P and Q subchannels of the CD master. There are other rules that we used to have to follow back in the day. For example, when I was first checking CD masters on U-matic tape, you wanted to leave 10 to 15 CD frames, which is about 1/3 of a second after the start flag before the music started, because CDs can't actually scan to a sector accurate position. The laser will go in and it will be off at the in point when you skip tracks, by a few frames. So to avoid the possibility that the beginning of a track was clipped, you would set the PQ flag, the start flag of the track, slightly before the audio started, and at the end you would then leave an extra little bit. In between the start and end flags, according to the Red Book spec, you should have digital silence, not even dither, and certainly not analog noise. In practice, people broke that rule all the time because they did albums that were mastered in analog. Another great trick, if you're doing it, which completely violates the Red Book spec, but a nice thing if you're doing a live album, is to include any chat in between songs after the end flag of a song and before, am I getting this right, the start flag, so that when the CD plays through, you see a countdown into the next song while the chat is happening. Let's say the lead singer tells a story that takes 20 seconds to tell. You'll see the track before end, then you'll see the counting down 20, 19, 18, so all the way down to 0, and then it'll start. But that means you can skip through the CD and queue up the start of the song perfectly without having to listen to all of the chat. And also, if you put in a program play, you can listen to the songs and you won't get the chat that leads into the next song on the end of the song you just listened to. What else was there in the Red Book spec? You had to have, at some point on the CD, a peak level above -6. I don't think that's was ever a rule that I saw enforced. Actually, there was one time I saw that rule enforced and we had a really hard time because it was a classical production. The producer had used some kind of fancy noise shaping dither and said quite correctly that by changing the gain of the signal, we had messed that up. And even if we'd added extra dither, we'd change the sound of his master. So that's another example of a Red Book specification that's ignored. There was also a distinction. There was something called the Orange Book. Orange Book was what you got when you had a CDR. So if you had a recordable CD where you could record a song and then another song and then another song in what were called separate sessions, so you could kind of pause the recording and come back and add songs later on. You had a disc that would only play in the recordable CD player until you fixed it up at the end. So you pressed the thing to finalize it and it would write a table of contents onto the disc. At that point, it became an Orange Book CDR. I think that was to do with where this table of contents was stored on the CD, if I remember correctly. So that was a kind of distinction between two books. All of these things are kind of irrelevant now. In theory, a modern CD burning program should produce you a Red Book master in the sense that it complies with all of the technical aspects of the spec and it's recorded in one hit in one session. But in practice, you know, those rules about start and end flags and gaps between songs and all the rest of it, people break those left, right, and center. So Cam says it's got to go. His battery's at 5%. Thanks. Nice to chat to you. Maybe see you for the next one. I think we're pretty much done. You can watch this on the replay anyway. So yeah, I think the Red Book is a kind of interesting historical footnote at this point. Although, for example, you shouldn't send an Orange Book disk for replication. Whenever you start and stop recording on a CDR, you get these things called link blocks in between the songs. They're basically dead, kind of wasted space on the CDR. There's a mess when the laser starts and stops. So the player will eventually skip over those so that you don't hear any of that. That's one of the ways that the Orange Book differs from the Red Book. And if you had a CD pressed from an Orange Book recorded CDR, you could end up with clicks in between the tracks when that Orange Book disc is used as a master to make manufactured CDs. But I'm just kind of thinking about, I can't think of any real situation where the Red Book spec really has an influence these days. Well, I guess, I mean, there is some CD burning software that allows you to, append tracks at different times and all the rest of it. One of those would not be suitable for making a CD master from. So I think the bottom line is if the disc that you supply doesn't mostly conform to the Red Book spec, it might get kicked back by the replicator for whatever reason. But most modern, I mean, again, 10 years ago, not all software would produce Red Book compliant masters. These days, I would imagine most of them do. I'm not aware of any CD burning apps that's kind of incapable. Maybe if you burnt something directly from the Finder in a Mac, or using, I don't know, Windows Media Player or something on a PC, then you might have a problem. But if you're working and if you're compiling your final master in a piece of software and burning a CD master or making a DDP image in one hit, you should be fine. Let's go back to the YouTube window and just see whether that answered the question. I don't see any. Oh, good. Bob says no problem at all. I guess that means it was no problem for me to mention his query, even though it wasn't strictly speaking a question. And if Carl is still here, he's not saying he's confused. Oh, thanks. I appreciate it. Oh, you're welcome. Pleasure. Thanks for the questions. So good. I'm not seeing any questions. Last chance. That's about an hour. That's pretty good. That's nice and neat and tidy. Excellent. Well, thank you very much for watching. I hope that was useful or interesting. Keep the questions coming. Great questions make for great Hangouts. Depending on how many there are, we'll do another 1 or 2 of these Hangouts later in the course. It's always good fun to do them, get to chat to you guys, get an idea who's on the course, and any particular interests you might have. And of course, there's also, I'll keep an eye on the Facebook group. I'm not always super active there, but I do kind of watch the conversations and hopefully jump in every so often if necessary. So yeah, thanks for listening, and I'll see you for the next one.